All right, everybody. Hello and welcome back to our criminology course. And today we're going to be talking about conflict and critical theories. And these is probably the section of the course that has the most kind of being left out. Okay, there is a giant umbrella of conflict theories and critical theories, um, and I only have time to cover a little bit about a few of them. So this is a much, much, much more complicated idea and theory and worldview than just the tiny amount I'm going to be able to go through in this short video. Okay? Now, in general, conflict theory is a rejection of the consensus idea of society. Okay, so the consensus idea of society says that the legal system and society in general is built on consensus. We all come together as a society, we decide on a legal system and a political system and a social system that kind of brings the most happiness to the most people, right? Conflict theory says no. It's not consensus that brings about all of those factors of society. It's this conflict, and there's powerful groups and there's non-powerful groups, and the power is the defining characteristic of how a group creates systems and societies and factors in any given culture, right? So the groups with power are able to design the system specifically for their benefit and to maintain that group's power, right? Now, one of the kind of differences among the different conflict theories is the power having group one group, or is it many groups that are competing against both each other and the non-powerful group or groups, right? So is it one powerful group and then the non-powerful, or is it many powerful groups competing with each other and the non-powerful, right? But in essence, this theory kind of predicts that the more threat is seen by the power or the powerful groups, the more threat they see, the more they're going to rely on the criminal justice system to take care of that threat. The more they're going to use the legal system, whether it's by making new laws or enforcing this or that, or increasing or decreasing criminality, the less threat they see, the less they're going to have to utilize those systems to maintain their power base. The more threat they see, the more they're going to have to utilize those systems to maintain their power base, right? There are a few examples we can point to that shows kind of at least the idea here, okay? The first is the savings and loan scandal from the 80s, okay? This was an international thing, primarily in the United States and the UK, where the specific facts is honestly kind of beyond me, but it was a giant white collar crime issue. Basically, there was a whole bunch of fraud going on within the financial system that cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. And there was almost no penalty for it because the people who were committing those crimes were white collar, rich, powerful people. Even though that one scandal cost taxpayers more than like 100 or many hundreds of years worth of street crime, auto theft and armed robbery and things. The actual financial impact for that one savings and loan scandal was way higher than all of the auto thefts and burglaries and robberies combined. But almost nobody was punished for the white collar crime. Whereas all of our focus and our attention and our enforcement activities are focused on the non-white collar crime. Even looking back into history, the idea of vagrancy, right, which is still a crime in many parts of the country and many parts of the world. Vagrancy is kind of this ill-defined crime that's essentially boils down to hanging out with no visible need to be there, right? And this can be traced all the way back to the plague in Europe that killed off so many people in Europe that peasants realized there was a high demand for labor in some parts of the country. So they would leave where they and their ancestors had lived to go over to those other places to get increased pay in the areas that had been hardest hit by the plague because they needed that labor there. That the nobles and the people who controlled society in the areas that were losing this labor to the areas that were paying higher rates decided, instead of paying higher rates here, we'll just create this crime of vagrancy to prevent people from kind of leaving and going to these other areas. So if you're a peasant on your land doing your job, great. But if you try to leave and you start walking and or taking a cart or whatever to this other area, we're going to say no. And we're going to call that a crime. Okay? And it's still a crime today in many areas. Now, there has been specific research trying to quantify this idea of social threat. What groups do the powerful see as a threat? And when those perceived threats are measurably higher, does that increase criminal justice and law enforcement activity, right? And none of these measures are really perfect, but there does seem to be some impact here, right? So in areas, controlling for obviously things that need to be controlled for, areas of the United States that have higher percentages of African Americans and racial minorities and higher rates of poor people have increased money being spent on criminal justice, increased police numbers, increased arrests, increased use of force complaints, all of the things one might expect if this social threat idea was indeed impacting the enforcement of the criminal justice system. Another good piece of evidence for this theory is that the number or percentage or ratio of racial minorities being arrested is influenced by crimes where there is a minority offender and a white victim, but it's not affected when there is a minority offender and a minority victim. So this black on black crime, whether that goes up or down, does not really change the rate of black people being arrested. But when there's an increase in the rate of black offenders and white victims, there is an increase in black people being arrested. Okay? From international studies, when they look at cross-national data, the more diverse a country is, whether that's racially or economically or culturally, religiously, the higher rates of imprisonment they tend to have, and the more likely they are to use the death penalty. So that all of that kind of points to this conflict theory idea having at least some impact, at least some influence, right? Now, there are lots and lots of subtypes of conflict theory, right? What distinguishes the powerful from the non-powerful, all right? And we're going to talk about a couple of them, but we're only going to talk about each one very briefly, and we're not going to talk about a lot of them. But the three big ones are class, gender, and race, right? The division, the power is divided up based on class, gender, and race. So when talking about class, okay, the idea here is that there's a rich group. They have the system designed to favor the rich and promote their interests. And the non-powerful group are those of us without economic capital, right? And the major kind of person behind this idea was Karl Marx, whom I'm sure everybody watching this video has heard of, right? Karl Marx, super famous. He had that whole book and philosophy about class struggle and how class is so influential and powerful in life. And of course, he was writing 100 some odd years ago. But many claim his ideas are just as applicable today, right? And his idea was that there's two levels, two classes in society, right? There's the rich and there's the poor. And capitalism requires there to be rich and poor. And the rich are in control of the criminal justice system and the legal system and the political system. And they've designed it all around maintaining their power, right? Now, according to modern theorists who look into this, there are essentially 5 kinds of crime. There's the crimes committed by the poor, and there's the crimes committed by the rich, and each one has different subdivisions, right? So the crimes committed by the poor are either crimes of accommodation, where it's poor people trying to kind of get in there and commit crimes that are a direct result or symptom of this capitalist, rich people running things, poor people not getting what they need kind of thing, right? So this is, everything from drug use to burglary to robbery, right? We can't achieve our goals under this capitalist system that prevents us from gaining capital. So we're going to go out there and commit these crimes either consciously or subconsciously in an attempt to kind of get our needs met because we can't meet them otherwise because of this rich-poor divide. Then there's crimes of resistance, which are direct attacks on this capitalist system, right? So burning down a factory, protesting loss of wages, crimes that are specifically designed to attack this capitalist system and try to develop and create a more fair system. Those are the crimes of the poor, are one of those 2 categories. The crimes of the rich fall under crimes of domination, which are crimes committed by the rich to maintain their power base, to maintain their power status. Things like companies committing wage theft, right? Not paying overtime when they should, not paying for hours worked, not purchasing safety equipment, not following OSHA regulations, companies dumping pollution into rivers and air, in other areas. And then crimes of control are crimes committed by the legal system, by the criminal justice system, right? So this is police brutality and excessive force and, judges taking bribes to send juvenile offenders to certain facilities instead of others. And then crimes of government, which is, corruption, politicians taking bribes, things like that. One of the predictions of this kind of class-based conflict theory is that the social societies will use imprisonment as a way to regulate labor. So as a society needs more labor because their economy is in an upswing, they will have lower rates of imprisonment. But if the country or society has a surplus of labor, they will use imprisonment as a way to kind of siphon off some of that labor so that it can be kind of saved for the times when they need more labor, and then imprisonment rates will go down again. Research here is not exactly supportive. This seems to have been the case sometimes, where as labor became easier to find, imprisonment rates increased, but then other times it's gone the opposite direction. So it doesn't seem to have too much, at least this particular measure has not necessarily been in compliance with that idea, if that makes sense. All right, so feminist conflict theory. All right, so feminist conflict theory of feminist ideals looks at the powerful, this power, non-power divide as men have power, women don't. They call this kind of a system the patriarchy, right? Rules are designed by men for men to kind of keep women out of having that social, economic, and political power so that men can stay the powerful group and keep women, at home, being stay-at-home moms, making babies, all those kind of stereotypical feminine processes. And one of the issues here is that men are arrested far more, they're convicted far more, they're, every measure of crime we have says men are put into the system and commit far more crimes than women. But that's not necessarily against this feminist idea of men having power and women not having power, and men using the system to maintain that power. Okay? Because first of all, there are many instances, many sub-kinds of crime where women are vastly overrepresented. One of those areas is children running away from home and other status offenses, right? So status offenses, if you remember from, I believe, Section 1, are those things where it is illegal for juveniles to do it, but it's absolutely perfectly legal for adults to do it. So things like running away, truancy, things like that. Boys tend to commit those status offenses far more, but women are arrested and sent through the formal process far more. So when boys do it, society doesn't seem to care. But when girls do it, they're corrected and punished and sent through that formal legal process far more, right? And this, according to this theory, is from this idea of the patriarchy, in that women, especially young women, girls, are seen not as individual agents capable of making their own decisions, but as the kind of property and under the control of parents when they're young, and then husbands when they're older. And that is the explanation for why girls are so much more often arrested and sent into the system for these status offenses, when boys, despite committing them more, are just much less likely to be formally punished for them. Okay. Women are also vastly overrented in involuntary psychiatric commitments. Right? So one of the alternatives to either juvenile detention or even adult detention is kind of involuntary commitment to a psychiatric facility. And women are vastly overrepresented in that group. And that kind of ties into that same view of women as needing to be feminine and needing to exhibit these certain traits. And if they're not doing what they should, that is a big problem, and we need to send them to the psychiatric facility because clearly something is wrong with them and that's not good. Whereas when men do it, who cares? They're bonkers, they're nuts, they're doing this thing that's wrong, but whatever, that's not our problem, right? So there's lots more examples. As you can see from the image above, there's one more kind of example of how there are these certain instances and certain subsets of crime and certain situations where it is very clear that the criminal justice system is being used as a tool against women in ways that are very different from how they're used against men. Okay? But a couple of the other kind of issues that the feminist criminal justice theory kind of contends with or attempts to describe or explain. Number one, there's the contention that the entirety of crim theory, all of the theories that we've talked about so far in this class, and most of the ones we're going to talk about in later sections, they're all male-dominated. They're theories by men to explain crime by men. And they don't necessarily explain the criminality of women in the same way because they weren't tested on women. They weren't created with women in mind, right? So if we find, say learning theory, we know learning theory works really well to describe the criminality of juvenile males. But it hasn't been tested nearly as much on juvenile females. Maybe it explains female crime too, but maybe it doesn't, right? But because it was designed to explain criminality of males, it's not necessarily applicable to the criminality of women, right? There's also this issue of the gender gap in crime decreasing. So as time goes on, the difference between male criminality and female criminality is getting closer and closer and closer and closer and closer. And they haven't met yet, but they might soon if trends continue, right? So why? Why are these two groups committing crime in more and more similar ways over the past 30, 40, 50 years? Whereas they used to be really different, now they're only a little different. Why? Is it because women are, have a much more likely now than they were in the 1970s to have jobs and go out and work and spend time out of the house more? They spend their time taking care of children less? Is it because they're getting more educated now? Is it because, there's lots of different ideas on why this gender gap is decreasing. But is it because women are becoming more criminal, or is it men becoming less criminal? Right? So there's lots of different possibilities or paradigms that could explain why this gender gap is decreasing. All right? One of those is the power control theory, which comes from this guy named Hagen. The way Hagen saw it, there are two different kinds of families. Okay? The traditional view of families, and the one that was dominant for a long time, is the patriarchal family, where the father is the head of the household. The father works, the mother stays home. But what was increasing back in the 80s and has become even more common these days is the egalitarian family, where both parents work. Both parents share responsibility for income. Both parents share responsibility for raising children, etc., right? And the idea here is that in patriarchal families, mothers would be more controlling on daughters than they would on sons, because men are seen, because the father is the head of the household, the father should be the one to discipline the son, but because that's powerful group dealing with powerful group, and less powerful group, mother dealing with less powerful group, daughter. So in patriarchal families, there will be a very high degree of gender gap in offending, because the daughters had been controlled by the mothers, but because the father was working and spending his time doing the manly man things that husbands and fathers are supposed to do according to this system, the sons get much less supervision, much less guidance, much less, the crime preventing values, and thus there's going to be a very large gender gap in offending. Whereas in egalitarian families, where both parents work, both parents share responsibility for things, sons and daughters are going to get roughly an equal amount of all those, social control and values and learning and all that stuff, and thus the gender gap is going to be very small. There's not a lot of research on this because it's really difficult to kind of measure how patriarchal or egalitarian a family is, and whether that really does have an effect on how much each parent spending time controlling and socializing with children of different genders and stuff. But the research that has been done, not really. Okay? Now, the third type of conflict theory we're going to talk about is based on race. And here we have the powerful and the non-powerful, with the powerful being white and the non-powerful being kind of everybody else. The most kind of popular in media and research is black or African American, right? But there's also Native American, Hispanic, other racial minorities have less power. White people have power, and it's race that determines powerful from non-powerful for that whole conflict theory paradigm and worldview. And with this one, there is a known and very obvious racial difference at all levels of the criminal justice system. Arrests, convictions, sentences, death penalty. The blacks are vastly overrepresented at all levels. If you look at prisoners sitting on death row, blacks are hugely overrepresented. Just prison and jail inmates, blacks vastly overrepresented, and other racial minorities as well. But the question is why, right? Why are these smaller groups, these racial minorities, so vastly overrepresented? Now, there's kind of three options. Okay. Number one, differential involvement. This means black people are actually committing crimes more than white people. Second option, differential scrutiny. Black people aren't necessarily committing more crimes, but they are in areas where police spend more time. They're more likely to be seen and caught committing their crimes, and thus that explains their overrepresentation. And then the third option is just, if it's not differential involvement and it's not differential scrutiny, then it's just racial bias. There is some racist aspect of the system, right? And all three of these options have been measured in many different ways. When it comes to differential involvement, especially with minor crimes like drug use and things like that, there doesn't seem to be a differential involvement. Blacks and whites smoke marijuana at almost the exact same rate. So differential involvement might explain some of it in some crimes, but not a lot. Differential scrutiny, there's also been research on it, and there is some degree of differential scrutiny, right? But then the question is, how much of what crimes can we explain with those first two, leaving the rest of it as just clear racial bias, right? But there is clearly something going on. So, interestingly, race does not, when directly measured, or when we measure these as closely as we can, race doesn't seem to play a factor in either conviction rates or sentences for murder and sexual assault when you're talking about the race of the offender. The race of the offender doesn't seem to matter when it comes to sentencing and what sentence somebody gets for murder and sexual assault. What does play a factor is the race of the victim. If the victim is white, that seems to increase the sentence for murder and sexual assault a lot. But if the victim is black or Hispanic or Native American, that vastly decreases the punishments and the sentences for murder and sexual assault. So that's kind of mixed support for this idea of racial conflict theory, right? So the race of the offender doesn't matter, which seems to be evidence that it's not happening. But the race of the victim absolutely does matter. And obviously this is controlling for things like, age and prior criminal record and all those other factors. But even after controlling for all those, the race of the victim still has a serious effect on sentencing decisions. When it comes to other crimes than murder and sexual assault, looking at sentencing, it seems that legal variables like age, prior record, use of a weapon or not, things like that, explain most of the variation in sentencing. But not all of it. There is still some small amount that seems to be unexplained by all those legal variables, but is explained by the race of the offender. So one of the kind of one of the largest, most common theories is that there is no step in the criminal justice process where there is a large racial or racial bias. Okay? The differential involvement and differential scrutiny that may or may not be happening is the biggest driver of each individual step, with a very small effect of racial bias at each individual step. But because there are so many steps, right? Being pulled over, being searched, being arrested, being charged, being found guilty, being offered a plea bargain, sentencing, all these different things, when each one only has a very small racial bias factor to it, by the end of that process, each one of those small differences has compounded. And so at the end, we see a giant differential in racial impact, but it's really difficult to see any racial bias at any one stage. Really difficult to measure, really difficult to find. If you control for offense type and prior record and all those things, okay? But that seems to be what the research is saying. Racial bias is very small at each individual step, but those compound. And that's why we see these giant racial disparities at the end of this process when it comes to prison populations and jail populations and death penalty convictions and all those things. Now, the policies promoted by conflict theorists, of whether it's class or gender or race or whatever, the policies promoted here are very similar to policies we've talked about in previous chapters, previous sections, right? Diversion, decriminalization, deinstitutionalization, and attempting to make the world and the country and our society more fair between rich and poor, or black and white, or men and women, right? We need to have structural changes to bring equality based on those different factors, before we're ever going to get a true difference in the legal system, in the criminal justice system, and in society as a whole, right? So anyway, that is the end of conflict theory. Again, this is a much, much, much larger, more complicated thing. You know, I've given you a 35-minute lecture about it, but there could be an entire course just on conflict theory and different aspects of it and different claims and counterclaims and sub-theories here and sub-theories there and evidence for and evidence against and all those things. This is a really, really small, tiny description of what conflict theory is and evidence for and against, and it is a vastly more complicated thing than this relatively very short video can show. But that is the end of our discussion of it. I highly encourage you to go out there and learn more about this, but I will see you in the next one.